everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to Inside the Rookery. So tonight we're talking about narrative design. I've got Graham Davis, Andy Leask, fellow Rooks, and Cara Ellison is our guest tonight. As always, if you have any questions or comments, pop them up in the chat and I will bring them up on the screen. No, I'm not briefing the guest live on camera. You're briefing the guest live on camera. So don't be shy, jump in and join in the fun. So we do have some pre-submitted questions that I will kick off with in a moment after I've let Cara say hi.
Hello, hi. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, it's been a long time coming, this one. Yeah, I'm very excited.
Well, we're really pleased to have you here. The first question is pretty simple. Simple question, maybe not a simple answer. That is from Zoltan, the Golden Rook, and he asks, how would you define narrative design?
That is really, really hard. So thanks for opening with that one. So basically, in video games, generally speaking, a lot of the elements of virtual worlds will give you some aspect of the actual meaning of the world that you're in, as well as a sense of progression and what that progression actually means. And generally speaking, especially in video games, you need someone to kind of be in charge of the meaning of what stuff is or tells you, and that stuff can be anything, including audio design, animation, the map, the levels, the environment art, the dialogue, and everything. So you do need someone who's going to be basically what I call the undersecretary of meaning in video games, which is like basically you're trying to marshal all the elements of the game's output to tell the player something. And people find it really, really satisfying to actually feel like they're getting a sense of progression from their games. And so that's also kind of helped along by a story or characters that make you feel like you're achieving something. So basically my job is to try to marshal everyone together towards a common goal, which is like, giving the player a sense of that meaning and a sense of story and progression. So yeah, that's it.
And when do you pick that? If you're the undersecretary of meaning, and meaning can, as you say, translate through a lot of things, through maps, through audio, through the writing itself. When do you pick what that meaning will be? Do you sit down at the start and think about a theme, a tone?
Ideally, yes, that's the way that you would rather have it go. It doesn't always happen that way. In fact, some video games, believe it or not, towards the end of the development cycle, they'll be like, so what do all these things mean? I guess we should hire a writer. But unfortunately, that's not the best way of going around everything, because essentially, obviously, you want to be able to marshal that meaning straight from the beginning right to the end, and then also have the writing kind of structured so that it also kind of delivers that story and meaning that you kind of structured from the beginning. So the difference between a narrative designer and a writer is that the narrative designer is going to structure your game and sort all of those things and try to actually make that a cohesive structure that then lends itself to the writing, which is basically the last thing that you really do in the process. So the ideal is to essentially structure containers which then have writing and dialogue in them, and that's like the most the best way to do everything. Unfortunately, for many different reasons, a lot of people don't really recognize narrative design as being something that is its own discipline. I mean, ultimately, narrative design is really just being a game designer with some writing skills. And so it's quite hard, even in the industry itself, no one really agrees on what the meaning of narrative designer is. So that's another problem. But I just largely say, okay, narrative design is structuring the game design so that it tells a good story, and that's it really. So it is kind of ideal to start a development process with a narrative designer on board, but it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, so I preempted Zoltan's next question, which was, are you involved from the beginning? So ideally, yes. I've played, and Righty Stream Stuff says, I've played a fair few games over the year that felt as though the story was done at the end and sort of shoehorned in.
Probably was.
So in terms of the crossover narrative design into TTRPGs, Andy and Mark, do you have a similar concept that you would recognize as what you do, say, Graham, at the start of an adventure, or Andy, when you come in and you're starting to write for a game, do you ask what that narrative is, that meaning is, that tone?
I'll let Graham go first.
Okay. Yeah, ideally, yes. Ideally, you have a story in mind, and the story should mean something rather than just running around hitting things with swords. And it should have a theme and values and stuff like that. It's a little different from video game designs because as a writer, I'm going to separate writer and GM here, but as a writer, designer, your audience is the GM. You want to get the idea from your head into their head with the minimum of loss and distortion. And the only channel you have for that really is the writing and the art. Now, with a video game, you've got to wrangle, like Cara said, stuff like audio and all kinds of other things, gameplay, and so on. It's the same but different. It's more limited because you have fewer channels to play with, I guess, is the short answer.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that's been interesting for us, like Graham was saying, like whenever I'm kind of writing an adventure, like I always kind of begin with the why. I always begin with the what's the point of the story, and then but I don't think that's unique to narrative design. I think that's just good writing. I think like all good stories begin with a point. But what has been interesting is because obviously the question of mechanics, which is obviously something that's come up on our streams before, and how you use those. And I definitely think, and again, Graham, you have more experience of this than me, but obviously when you're writing to different systems, that definitely influences the color of the kind of story you can tell and maybe puts constraints on how you could kind of construct it. And obviously what's been interesting for us at the Rookery is writing system agnostic stuff, is that we've simultaneously freed ourselves from the shackles of any one system while constrained ourselves with having to come up with something that would fit within any potential system. And it's actually been good, but it has required a lot more conceptual planning, I guess, rather than simple structural planning. Like when I was first doing the very, very first planning on What Rides Beneath, I think I even tweeted it out, but I had this incredibly elaborate system. I would love to say it was some technological system, but it literally was Post-it notes all over my dining table in this kind of very complicated thing. But it was necessary to kind of go through all of that to kind of work out all the permutations. So, yeah.
And I've mentioned it before, but I always felt in the late 90s, early 2000s that the World of Darkness did narrative so well. So they used the same system for Werewolf the Apocalypse, for Vampire, for Mage, etc. But each of them had their own tone and themes and narrative that you kind of intimately understood as the storyteller when you read, because they spelled it out for you to spell out to your players. So that always strikes me as something where they'd really thought about their narrative design. Roderick asks, you may not want to answer this, Cara, without naming any names, can you give any horror stories of when the story's been left for the end?
Oh God. Well, I mean, one of the major problems of video games is that essentially the machinery has to work for the story to operate well, right? And so say, for example, you haven't quite got like a combat system to work, and you have to actually write quests that go along with the combat system, then if you are not getting the combat to work in the way that you always assumed it would work, then you would have to go back and rewrite the quests to coincide with all of that. And that means in some cases you have to redo the art, you have to redo the rest of this, some of the knock-on effects of the story, all of that stuff. So a big problem with video games is that all of the moving parts have to come together. And one of the major reasons that good stories happen in video games is because the game design meets the story exactly. And like you're saying, when you play a tabletop, it's like it's really, it feels really natural and really great if all the mechanics or the moving parts of the actual way you play the game, they kind of neatly dovetail into what you want to say with your character. So, like, for example, vampires are social creatures. So a lot of the mechanics that are actually related to vampires in World of Darkness are actually to do with social skills and for manipulating people and getting around people and making sure they do stuff for you. And so a lot of skills are based around that. And so what you really want to say about your character should be built into the way you play the game. Now, problems often come when those two don't meet, and that actually can be through no one's fault. They might not meet. And then the writer has to come in and like say why, or like write like reams of dialogue to explain the bizarre happenings or whatever, right? And so that's when the story starts to fall apart. It's because you don't have that much time and you don't have very much budget left, and all you've got are words, basically. And the strongest way to tell a story in a video game is actually not by dialogue or words, but by the literal way you interact with the world.
Yeah, I've found that to be the case on multiple projects, that either the writer's brought in too late, or the direction changes, or things that were planned don't get implemented. And, people hand wave and say, we'll fix it in post, which is a bit of a Rookery catchphrase, but it's always the writer who has to fix it in post, because words are in many people's perception, words are the cheapest thing.
I mean, in some respects, that's true. But in video games, the bigger problem is if you're recording actors.
Oh, yeah.
To go along with your dialogue, that's deeply expensive. One of the most expensive things you can do, because you're paying for an actor's time, you're paying for studio time, you're paying for, sometimes you're basically paying for the voice direction. Someone will need to come in and actually conduct the direction as a matter of, expertise. And so it can actually get really, really, really expensive if you're re-recording lots of dialogue. Obviously, text on the screen is cheap, but everything else very expensive. And then also, people forget about this one, localization. If you want to localize to other languages, that also means you have to send back all of the rewritten dialogue to get translated into Spanish and French. And that is going to take a lot of time as well as being expensive. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I found myself in the situation where I have to craft a new story with dialogue that's already been recorded. That's always fun.
I mean, it sounds like quite a nice postmodern kind of intellectual exercise, but
yeah.
In a way, yes.
So a question from the chat from Seagull. When you're putting together narrative for a game, do you consider the mechanics that are already in place when writing, or does the narrative come first and then mechanics are applied after? So a little bit of what you've just covered already.
I mean, I guess my answer is ideally narrative sits in alongside everything else. But the truth is, for things that are, for example, franchises or things that are like often in AAA video games, the very big budget games, they already know that they want it to be about some form of combat, unfortunately. And it's always going to be about how many folks can you kill and how dramatically can you kill them. And so most of the time what you're doing as a narrative designer is you're taking that basis, the way in which someone should be killed, and then trying to wrap around a reasonable excuse for someone to do that and not feel like a villain. And, you know, in the case of things like Doom, it's because, oh, you know, they're, you know, evil Martians or whatever. And in the case of BJ Blazkowicz, it's because he's Jewish and he's killing Nazis, and that's a really good excuse, right? Feels really good to play as him. And so basically what you're doing is you're making more and more elaborate excuses so that you can murder virtual people or things. I think personally, what's more interesting is the social systems. So the idea that you might not have to kill people or things, but in fact actually find structural systems and ways to navigate that are actually a little bit more refined than that. And that includes things like romance mechanics or seduction techniques, or things where you might solve puzzles or kind of navigate by exploration, those kind of things. But generally speaking, in the industry, in big video games, there's already an idea of the kind of mechanic you'll be doing to navigate through the game, whether it be like a Monster Hunter idea or whether it's something else. And so your job is to make that interesting and also justify why on earth the character would do that with their time.
Roderick says that such a stark and accurate depiction of so much of our media.
Isn't it just? Yeah.
We've talked about that in the Rookery, and we've talked about it on previous streams, that the Ship of Fools, the first adventure, that we'll be publishing, when we were talking about that and when the guys were designing it, they specifically wanted to offer different ways to get through issues that weren't just being a little band of murder hobos.
Yeah, it's one of the things that obviously, you know, a lot of us, we met as Rooks, and a lot of us worked on Warhammer, and it's one of the things that was most fun about the Wifrip system is that you could end up playing, just a little peasant or a lawyer, or you were somebody who wasn't necessarily a fighter, and unfortunately, like a lot of the default stories default to you end up in a fight anyway, and you're just somebody who's not skilled at fighting who now has to fight. And it's better when the stories allow you to play to your strengths and to think creatively, and
that was always my objective in writing stuff for Warhammer, was that I always thought that if it came down to combat, something had failed somewhere along the line, and it arose out of the fact that the combat was so deadly in the first edition, and
it fails a lot every week.
We didn't have time to fix it because the thing was due at the printers, and if it didn't come out in time for Christmas, we were all in big trouble. So I just wrote the adventures around that. Yes, combat's deadly. You get hurt. Be more intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that, something has failed if combat, happens, because I do like games that actually treat combat as the absolute last thing, the last solution for what's happening in front of you. Because what should happen, I think personally, is that everything else should be so wildly interesting that the combat is the last thing you'd want to do. And in many respects, when I approach RPGs, for example, I think that it's the strongest idea to actually try to prototype mechanics that mean that, as you say, combat is the last thing you'd want to do. And actually in RPGs, you can do that by essentially cutting off social, like kind of story-esque kind of rewards. If you kill someone, then obviously you've cut off that strand of a social interaction. And that actually means that you might have less resources, less story reward, less outcomes, less branches, and things like that. So I think one of the ways you can do that in an RPG is by saying, like, the more people you kill, the less of an actual story reward you have. So, yeah.
And there's one more from Discord. So with the Rooks, it's Susan, Henny, Yukimi, would the Rooks and their feather friends distinguish between story and narrative? So is that a useful distinction? You talked about the distinction between writing and narrative, but to you, is narrative story? Are they interchangeable?
I don't know. I'd be interested to know what you think, Andy, because I don't know if it is a necessary.
I mean,
Yeah.
I guess for me, like it's a subtle distinction, but the narrative sort of is the story and how the story is told, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The story is just the story, and the
Yeah.
narrative is what that story is, and then how you tell the story. So
Yes.
it's a slightly bigger picture, and then takes in all the stuff that you were talking about in terms of the mechanics and things as well. That's
Yeah.
part of how you, like, I love the way you express that, part of how you feed back to the player what the world is.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's true. In that, narrative is a method, a tool, for example, a set of tools for telling the player and orienting the player. And story, as you say, yes, is more like a kind of linear A to B. Like, I started off here and I got here. I guess that's probably the way I would separate it. What do you think?
I think that I agree with both of those points, and I would also add in narrative would include what the story tells you about the setting. Because story and setting are separate but very interlinked if things are done well.
And if you think from like what we're doing with the Call of Crown, for instance, like obviously we've got our main story, our main kind of Call of Crown campaign that we're telling, but around that we've got our locations in our kind of world of the Call of Crown that obviously describes places and NPCs and hooks. We've got our bestiary that describes creatures and kind of flora and fauna and things like that, and all of those have hooks as well. So like really what we are trying to do is to try and make everything we do part of one overarching narrative, but within it there's the specific story of the kind of Call of Crown.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's more useful to think about narrative as a set of rules, because what I keep thinking about is when I teach narrative design to like kids at schools, for example, one of the tasks I set them is essentially I want to get them writing barks, which are just like little dialogue pieces of information that NPCs will shout out to indicate to the player what they're thinking and what they're going to do. Like, basically it's just an informational thing. So for example, in an FPS, a bark would be like, she's over there, because that indicates to you, the player, you've been spotted. And so I always try to like do this kind of nice little thing with them where I give them, I say, choose a fairy tale, now choose a genre of video game, and now make a video game out of that fairy tale. And one of my favorite things that came out of that was they'd done an FPS where Cinderella was invading the prince's castle to get her shoe back because he'd stolen her shoe, and so it was an FPS where she's coming with machine guns, like gunning all these like guards down and stuff, and she's all her barks are like, I want my shoe back, give me my shoe. And so what's interesting about that, right, is it is a genre which is a first-person shooter, and the rules of a first-person shooter apply, but the narrative and the story themselves are dramatically different and require a different world than if it were just like a military shooter, for example. So it's so interesting to think about it that way, because they always do a really great job, all my kids that do that task. So yeah.
I particularly love the idea there that the camera would move with a particular way to reflect the fact that she only had one shoe on.
Yes, exactly. She's got one heel on and one non-heel on. And there's so many ways in which video games are completely unprepared for that kind of storytelling. First of all, the main character is generally not a woman. Second of all, no one ever thinks about what it's like to walk in heels. Really difficult. How do you convey that to players? Like, lots of interesting questions that my kids have thought about that video game developers just don't want to approach, because the person who plays that kind of game is not generally a woman, or they assume that she's not. So yeah.
Yeah, Andy and I, Andy Law and I were talking about Ghost of Tsushima, which I just finished recently, and that's really interesting because it's got options in it, so you can sneak and you can be a much less honourable samurai, or you can be quite an honourable samurai, but at key story points it chooses for you. You have to be dishonourable to advance that story forward, and Andy is playing it like I'm just sneaking around assassinating people, but he's playing it with like no assassination, no poison, no like kuni throwing at people, but he's going to be forced out of that story points. And I do love the game, and I can see why they've done it, but it did actually, it annoyed him. Look, you can see he's in the chat. He's getting his
like mechanically it doesn't it doesn't work. It
works very nicely in film and literature when a character's forced to act against their values. That can be quite poignant. But when you're expecting to be in control, yes, it's a damned annoying.
Yeah, well, so obviously I come from the school of immersive sims. So because obviously I have a history of working on things like Dishonored, but basically and if it was an immersive sim, then they would just let you choose, and then we'd branch the narrative according to the way you play. So if you're a sneaky player, then that would have a consequence in the world, and the world would respond to you that way. But obviously, because they're making this linear game, they had decided to railroad you, and so that might have been a consequence of budget rather than anything else, because it's really expensive to make immersive sims.
And here's a question from Cosmonaut that nicely leads on from that. So what are some specific tools that an Undersecretary of Meaning can use that would be less likely to result in the perception of railroading, lack of options, agency for characters or players?
So, I mean, the obvious thing about that is when you let the player choose, to keep reinforcing to the player that you've noticed that they've chosen that thing, and try to actually give them a response. And especially when I was working with the narrative lead on Bloodlines, one of the things that we did often kind of talk about was reactivity, which I think personally is a little bit of a BS word that we just kind of make up to encompass like how the game actually notices you, or like kind of validates your input into the world. So at every juncture, what we tried to do was like basically respond to the player and tell them that we'd noticed they'd made a particular choice for themselves. And also we tried to write in as many choices for them to express their character as possible. So that's kind of how we did it. I mean, obviously in Bloodlines, some of those ways are included in, some immersive sim styles, but things like if you are, say you're playing a kind of almost like Toreador way, you'd want to provide more seduction options and, things like that. And, you could put points into dominate people, so you can Jedi mind trick them into going a particular way. If you're Malkavian, for example, you might have some insight into what the person is about or secrets they're keeping from you. So things like that, those are like things that, you can put a stat up on your character, and then you can see that play out in the way that your character expresses themselves. And so we try to respond to all of those things. So yeah, that gives you a sense of agency when the game notices you and what you've done.
It's interesting now, because we had a discussion on the Discord server a wee while ago about experience points in tabletop RPGs, and like some people give them out just for milestones, and everybody's got different preferences, and there's a lot in there. But one of the things that came up that was more contentious than I thought it would be was GMs just offering like spot rewards for characters, like doing good role-playing things or making interesting decisions or things that, like behaving in character in a way that didn't necessarily do the obvious shortcut thing, but was then kind of enriching the story and the world somehow. And I guess that's one of the strong arguments for that is exactly what you say, is reacting and rewarding the fact that they are thinking creatively.
Why was it controversial, do you think?
I think some people, I don't know, there's so many different things around what we're meant to be rewarding, and some people would feel from an equity perspective not all players are comfortable. Like in our games, we all speak in character all the time, we all put on silly accents, and we're fine with that. But there are maybe other groups where people are less comfortable with that, and therefore are you penalizing that player if you reward someone else for doing a thing that they're never going to do, and things like that. And there is always that thing, GMs do need to manage the social dynamics of their table. But
equally, that's the strength of tabletop. That's quite an organic.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Because you can't do that in video games, because you have to kind of predict ahead of time what people might choose or what they might want. But with tabletop, you can just let people participate that way, which I think is amazing.
And Creative Fossey has asked a specific question about tabletop. Is it fair to say you have to be a good storyteller to be able to narrate on the fly? All too often, PCs wander off and away from what you've already prepared, making you create on the spot.
It's our sacred duty as players to go off piste. That's what we do.
Yeah, that was the toughest thing when I started working on video games after having worked a lot in tabletop RPGs, was that, when a computer program doesn't know what to do, it just falls over. Whereas, when you're writing for a GM, you can be a little more loose, rely on them to apply their creativity to the situation. It gets a bit boggling. You've got to kind of foresee everything, or appear to have foreseen everything.
Yeah, I mean, one of the cooler things you can do with video games is surprise people with how much you actually predicted they might do, which obviously, in things like the Stanley Parable is like the core of the game, is that every time you do something different, you're surprised with the fact that Davey predicted that you might make that decision, right? It is railroaded in some ways, but like things like in The Witcher, when you kill everyone in a village, they all remember you, and every time you come back to that village, they bring their mates, and they're like, "That's the guy," right? And so that's really surprising, and like it's lovely to have the opportunity to do that in a game, but you have to do a lot of play testing to figure out that that's going to happen.
Yeah, and it has serious budget and schedule implications as well.
The next question is from Kilishandra. So how do you use a game's narrative to disguise unavoidable game systems? But just before we get to that, there's a few comments in the chat. So Darker Days Radio, I just wanted to bring this one up. Oh, it's way back in the chat now. Of course it is. We were likewise, he really disliked how in Mass Effect you end up doing postman type activities just to get info out of a character, when really, as a sort of space cop, you should just be able to show your badge and force the issue.
Yeah. So do you think that what's meant by that question is ultimately fetch quest type stuff, where it's like, you have to do a resource quest and it's kind of a dull idea, but a narrative can really spice that up? Or is that what's meant, do you think?
I think so. I think like the idea that it feels like padding, doesn't it? When you're doing a thing, the reason you're doing it is because the game is telling you have to do it. But for the character, it doesn't actually make sense for you to do it. It's that disconnect, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, so one of my favorite examples of this, I mean, obviously I've done it in my work. A lot of it is not released now, so I can't talk about that. But one of my favorite ways in which you can dress up a fetch quest, which is unfortunately a lot of what you do in RPGs is dressing up a fetch quest into something more spicy, right? Is like the fact that you can make it not boring by flipping people's expectations on their head. So you can take an expectation people have from characters or the story or a fetch quest itself or the mechanics of the way that the fetch quest works. And you can really do something interesting with it. In The Witcher 3, for example, one of my favorite examples of this is where you go on this fetch quest and you have to find this witch or whatever. And the witch is like, I don't know, naked in a bath or something. And, she's basically like, well, if you want the information, you'll have to sleep with me. And you're like, well, that doesn't cost me anything. I'm Geralt. I can do anything. Obviously my, junk is magic and, I'll do, I can do whatever. And so you do end up sleeping with her. And then after that, she's like, okay, then off you go. Bye. See ya. Right. And she's acting as if she's used you, which obviously, traditionally speaking, is your job as the player to use other people. And she's actually used you. And I think that was so surprising to me, because to feel used by an NPC is really unusual, because most RPGs, especially Mass Effect, for example, that we've just been talking about, it's as if all the NPCs are just lying around waiting for a hero to turn up one day to make them coffee because the coffee machine is far across the chasm or whatever, right? And you're just like, no, that's not how people really work. They have their own agendas, their own, what they want is separate from what you want. And making the world feel like that. And, you know, is really important. One of the rules that we had on Bloodlines, for example, was the fact that every single NPC, like, why would they ever want to associate with you? And actually telling a player to go away and that kind of reverse psychology makes people want to conquer the NPC more. And actually buying into that and buying into the fact the NPC doesn't want anything to do with you is often the better choice. Not, oh my God, I've been waiting for you my entire life. You can solve all my problems. You're so powerful. I love you. That is actually not very appealing. So yeah.
Yeah, Mihao, I'm not sure what Andy's comment, when helping players grow, how do you balance extrinsic and intrinsic rewards? In video games, can AI learn what a player enjoys and pepper more of these elements without rewards?
I don't know. Like, these emergent systems can only go so far, and a lot of the processing in video games, it can be quite demanding to run all the game systems at once. And so actually a lot of AI behaviors are extremely basic in video games. And that's not because people can't do fancier AI. It's mainly because it takes up a lot of resources to run that behavior. And also, secondly, lots of playtesting has shown that people don't actually notice how clever an AI is if they don't understand what's actually being performed in front of them. So, like, for example, a lot of people don't know this, but in Deadly Premonition, which is a classic B-movie game that has a David Lynch kind of angle on it, a lot of the NPCs at different times of day will perform different tasks and be in different parts of the town, and you can follow them around the entire day and see what they're up to. But no one really understands that the game is that clever. And obviously it's not an AI behavior, it's just a script. But people don't really care, and they don't notice, and they don't actually know these things can be done. They just assume that it can't be done, or that it's just a one-off that they've spotted a particular animation. So a lot of fancy AI behaviors are not in video games, mainly because it's a waste of your time. And that's kind of why games are not more clever. Things like DayZ, for example, where there is emergent behavior, like that's kind of the maximum you could go with that kind of thing, I think.
And there's a lot of like illusory stuff, isn't it? Like the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War and the Nemesis system and stuff is not as AI as you think it is, but it feels like it is. Like, it feels like it's reacting.
Yeah, most things that you think are emergent behavior are actually very heavily scripted. Yeah, because they have to know that it's going to work and it's not going to look clumsy. You know, we've all seen a clumsy AI behavior in a video game. Like, for example, in old GTAs, you used to be able to see that all the cops like roll like together all at once in a kind of formation, and it just looks weird. So yeah.
So here's one specifically for you, Cara, from Darker Days. I think he's in the chat as Darker Days. How do you go about filling in powers, abilities that work on the tabletop for Vampire, but in a single-player computer game do not translate, yet you still want to retain some of the themes of that power?
It's difficult. I mean, generally speaking, what you do is you have to marry the expectations of a video game player with the expectations of a tabletop player, and that can be quite hard. So in terms of that, like things like, I mean, there's no reason why a vampire would ever pick up a gun, right? Like, because a vampire is a worse weapon than a gun. Like, why would you need one, basically? You might pick up a gun, and then you just don't need it, basically. If you're like really fast as a vampire, then why would you need a gun, essentially? But RPG players expect that they're going to be able to pick up a gun, so you're going to have to provide it for players. However, one of the interesting things about like translating from tabletop to video games is like you can choose according to what character you want to express, and you have to kind of look at, you know, how they would behave with that particular thing. So what you might do is you might balance it so that the gun is actually a lot weaker as a weapon than, say, like a spell that you might cast, or that it's a lot weaker than just literally going up to a guy and like punching them in the face or biting them or things like that, right? So, and you also can marry in like extra benefits of like biting someone, for example. You get like more powers, more bonuses from doing that than you might shooting them. And so you can kind of like try to negotiate between the two. It is very hard though, but basically it's like kind of a back and forth of going, okay, like what would a vampire do? And how can we marry that with the expectations of like a modern RPG? And yeah, it's quite difficult, but it's again, like, it's just like play testing and seeing what's fun and what expresses vampire and what doesn't.
I could only ever play an alien in Alien versus Predator. For that very reason, because you like got your health back by just like devouring them, and I was too scared to play a marine.
Yeah, and like one of the cooler things is, you know, like if you have like hyper speed and stuff like that, then obviously it makes things easier for you. So yeah, there's a load of different things you can do to. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but as a narrative designer, I'm like, what makes sense for the character? Like, just look at the character and like how you customize your character, and then the system should go from there. But obviously that's not always the way it works in video games. You might have to accommodate like a system across all different characters, but it might have a different animation each time, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because I sometimes it's one of the reasons that I quite like sneaking, because it gives me time to like consider what I'm going to do. I don't necessarily work well under pressure of the moment with like a gun in my face. Who would?
And you get more information as well from listening.
Exactly. I like to like slow and steady wins the race for me.
I would have thought you'd have liked to play a Predator then, though. It's like I always find them more sneaky.
Yeah, but not in Aliens versus Predator, because the aliens were so scary that like I just had to button mash and like all the people. That's my impression of an alien in that game.
It's pretty authentic. Yeah, very
nice.
I thought so. So where are we? Sorry, Mihao says, sorry, my comment was muddled. Andy Leask mentioned rewarding players in equity, the role-playing point. While some players desire rewards like XP or gold, others really only need and crave a good narrative.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point. I mean, like, probably the some of the role-playing highlights that I've kind of had have been like sort of late game in our very, very long Warhammer campaign that we had, where we, and I think we had the same thing in Vampire, where we almost reached the point of we stopped tracking XP, and just at certain points we would just revisit our character sheets with Andy and kind of, you know, progress them the way that made most sense for the character, because it was much more about storytelling. And I know that I loved that. I think you loved it, Lindsay. I know one or two of our friends who were playing with who they hated it because they liked the idea of accruing XP and then getting the choice of what they spent it on. And it's just different. And I don't say that to criticize them. Like, it's just a different aspect of the game. I've never been that interested in building optimal builds. Like, it's for people who know from when I used to frequent the Rat Catchers Guild Discord, I've regularly requested in the suggestions channel that we have a separate channel just for optimal builds, so that I could mute it and I didn't ever have to hear those conversations, because I hate it. I find it just, it's so alien to me. It's just not how I play RPGs. I'm not interested in coming up with the toughest guy. I'm interested in coming up with the most interesting character. That's what
That's really interesting, because again, like the way we were making Bloodlines, like the way the dialogue would work is that this shortcut is always punch in the face, or, you know, like that option is like the shortcut for people who want the conversation to be over and they don't really like the idea of role playing. Again, the option was always punch in the face, or like brutalize this person, or manipulate them. And like a lot of your skills are also shortcuts. If you've leveled up on seduction, you can just seduce someone into doing something for you if you're a high level that way. Or you can explore the conversation by asking for more info, or by being more conversational. Or you might find like other ways around the conversation. And like always, when we were writing the dialogue options, we would always give that option for the player who likes sneaking or likes to know more information, players who like to be seductive, players who like to brutalize people, players who just want to get the conversation over with, you know. So the idea is that you've always got like an option for someone. That also includes, by the way, the funny answer, which is always my favorite.
Yeah.
Great. I'm sure, Graham, that's your favorite too. The king of the puns.
Oh yeah. I can't resist a good smart ass answer.
Roderick doesn't get his comment read out because he's used too many acronyms. Please expand.
Call of Cthulhu / basic roleplay.
Thanks.
So those are the ones where the way
my mind goes blank.
Yeah. So those are the ones where you advance, where you've used the skill in the session and you roll it to see if you use it, which on the one hand is good because it rewards the idea that the more you use a skill, the more likely it is to go up. But equally, it can lead to people just randomly finding reasons to shoehorn skills in where it's not appropriate.
That's true. Yeah.
I like that. That's one of the skill advancement that I'm quite a fan of. But
and also advancement isn't guaranteed because if I remember correctly with basic role playing, you roll against your current score and you need to get over it to advance. So I mean it's true to life, you know, the more skills you get, the harder it is to advance. It's like an exponential curve, but that can be frustrating if you're used to min-maxing characters.
Yeah. I think that's why I like it as well, because it means the way you advance emerges out of how you play, which feels inherently right to me. That feels like the way it should work.
Yeah.
Roderick says, "Why would I want RPGs doing?"
That's a fair point. That's a fair point, mate. Yeah.
Can't argue with that.
So Cosmonaut says, "Are there any narrative possibilities we haven't seen yet for hybrid TTRPG, CRPG experiences that might become possible with next generation virtual tabletops?"
Oh, I'm sure people are working on that even as we speak.
They probably are. I mean, although apparently a lot of money is going into NFTs these days. I don't know why. Every time I'm like, oh, what game is anyone working on? They're all like, oh, an NFT based game. I'm like, what?
A technology in search of an application. It still doesn't sound
right. Like, I'm like, who would want to do that? But yeah, so I'm not sure I've encountered anything that really excited me yet, but for me, the idea that so I worked on a TV show for kids called Last Commanders for the BBC. And basically that is almost like the hybrid, because essentially it's a series of escape rooms that are tied together by a narrative, like a System Shock type narrative. So like I made System Shock for kids, which is not advisable, but that's basically what it is. And there's an evil AI on the space station. You have to guide your avatar through the series of these kind of escape room situations, and the actor has like a kind of peep show style like camera on their head, and you can see the room and their perspective, and then the kids will like Skype in and then basically tell their avatar what to do and how to get out of this horrible situation. There's like story obviously tying all this together, and NPCs that you encounter. It's like kind of like a nightmare. Yeah, like kind of like nightmare, but System Shock nightmare basically. And so that was really exciting for me, because that marries exactly like tabletop stuff with video game stuff and then puts it in TV. And it's like really something that I think is exciting. Like the idea that we might have more interactive media that way is really cool as well. And just being able to actually allow kids to participate in virtual worlds that are slightly different than what they normally experience.
I know you're very modest about this, Cara. Was this the one that you won the BAFTA for?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you took that to the BAFTA.
You should be proud of it. I'm celebrating my friend's achievement. You should be proud of it.
Well, it did win a BAFTA, and it's due to the wonderful work that everyone did on it. So yeah.
So Darker Days Radio says, my favorite computer board game merges leaders, basically Risk with tech trees and diplomacy managed by a tablet.
I don't know that one.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that the adventure game.
Yeah, the XCOM board game has got like an app that controlled it that was quite clever, because it added a degree of randomity to what was happening, but it also controlled like the pace of it. So it added that tension of you had to play kind of very quickly.
Yeah, I did play a board game that was like you use an app, and it's like a kind of murder mystery board game where like you go there and interview people, and then you can like ask them questions on the app. But I didn't find it particularly effective, and it was quite clunky and hard to use. It just seemed like an extra step that you shouldn't have to do, basically.
Right.
So yeah, integrating the two can be quite hard, I think.
Like the XCOM one worked well, but it worked too well because it was stressful in the way that XCOM is stressful. So it was a really great experience, but you played it like once at the night, you were like, right, we need a rest now. We're not going to play that game because...
Well, my favorite thing in XCOM was always like naming all my troops after people I know and then getting ridiculously attached to them for whatever reason. And then like, and then get really upset when they get killed off. So yeah, that was my thing. So I don't know. I don't know if I want to be immersed in XCOM.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, Andy Law does the same thing. He names them all after like role play characters, PCs, NPCs, and then becomes ridiculously attached to them.
Yeah. The worst one I ever heard was that someone had named all of their characters after their household pets because they had quite a lot of pets, and I was like, oh no.
Oh, do you not know what game you're playing?
I know, what awful idea. Fluffy has been shot and he died on this particular hill, and you're like, oh my god, Fluffy.
So Kilishandra has asked from the Discord, I scooped it up, what's your tips for concisely showing character through dialogue?
This is an interesting one because it's mostly to do with craft, writing craft, and essentially the way you would do it is one of the major things that I find when you start out writing dialogue as a junior writer is that essentially every character you write has your voice, your personal voice, like the way you would say something. But that's actually not the best way to go about it. The best way to go about it is basically imagine a character, or imagine a person that you know in your real, like, actual life that might have some resemblance to how the character might behave, like has similar background or similar outlook, for example, and actually think about how they might say it and think about their habits and tics and like little things they drop in or their obsessions, and start to think about how they might negotiate the world and the ways in which that person is different from you. And that's actually really hard, and it requires actually a little bit of life experience, I find, and also kind of a thing I used to do a lot was just sit in cafes and listen to people having conversations and just eavesdrop, like flat out eavesdrop on people. And I think the more people you meet, the more you realize that like the different ways that people express themselves can be like so different from the way you might do it. And so, I mean, for me, what's really interesting is when I worked on Void Bastards, I was working for a team that was Chinese Australian. And so they had like obviously like Chinese roots, but they were very, very Aussie. So they were like very kind of their language was language use was dramatically different from mine. So one of the things we wanted was that the future depicted in Void Bastards, which is very 2000 AD, we wanted it to be a mix of cultures. So I decided, right, we'll have some space pirates, and they'll be Chinese Scottish. So they might look like they have a Chinese background and they're Chinese culturally, but they express themselves in a really Scottish way. And so I asked my friend Jane for Cantonese swears that she could translate into English, and then I translate those into Scots. So basically our space pirates swear in Scots, but with a Cantonese sentiment. And my favorite one ever is in Cantonese, if someone says fall on the street, as in like it's like really humiliating, it's right out in public, it hurts, like fall on the street is like a Cantonese curse, and apparently it's like one of the worst ones. And so I was like, oh, amazing. So like fall on your arse is like something that the pirates say in Void Bastards. So that was an interesting way of expressing not only like the root of the character, but also saying it in a way that people might not have encountered before.
And really deepening your world building there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so few games that get the opportunity to do as much world building as we did for that game. So yeah, it was really amazing.
Meow says eavesdropping at coffee shops was a homework assignment when I took Theatre 101 in college.
Very
Good.
one, too.
Yeah.
Dark Days Radio does it too. Andy Law, who is on the chat for Rookery Publications tonight, also does it. So you're not alone in eavesdropping on people.
I'm a creeper. I just listen all the time. And I try to like figure out exactly what people might have experienced that produces the way they talk as well, and how they express themselves.
Yeah, the weirdest one was when Andy and I were in a coffee shop, and we weren't eavesdropping. We were sitting near this person, and we looked over, and he was writing a letter to Lindsay Law, and that was just a bit weird. It's not a very common name. So Roderick has asked the most important question about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. Will there be an opportunity for cybergoth industrial dancing, or has that been ruined for the entire games industry by Fortnite?
I think when I last saw the game, there was indeed an opportunity for you to dance like the original dance animation in the first one. But one of the interesting things about the game when I was working on it was the fact that it was like, it's supposed to be modern day Seattle, and vampires try really hard to melt into the modern day kind of background and like behave the way that people expect them to in modern day and in Seattle. And so a lot of what we were doing was trying to recreate how Seattle actually works now. And I think like the idea back when Mitsoda worked on the original Bloodlines was essentially to look at, you know, how Santa Monica, for example, functioned then as well, and try and capture like that essence. And so, yeah, like it's kind of like a darker, like through the veil version of Seattle. So, unfortunately, one of the things that like people will definitely, I feel, remember is that, you know, there's quite a bit of like cyber industrial stuff going on in the original Bloodlines, but like because time has moved on so much, like obviously that's not like a thing that happens in Seattle, but there is the remnant of like, like the grunge era in Seattle still. Like it's kind of died out, but like there's a sense that like Seattle's like that grunge kind of background. So like that's kind of more the direction I think they were going, where they were trying to give a sense of like the grunginess of Seattle and stuff like that. So yeah.
There's a question from Zoltan, which was from way earlier, but he didn't mean seminar. I think actually what he meant was like course, like university course, or is there somewhere you could do narrative design like you could do other kinds of design?
I don't know of a specific narrative design course, but I would recommend the game design courses at Abertay. I know essentially that a lot of my friends actually teach on that course, and it's an exceptionally good university course. So I think what I would do if I went back in time and gave myself advice is basically to take a game design course at Abertay, because it gives you a really rounded idea of what the games industry is actually like. And you might end up thinking, oh, I don't really want to go into narrative design, because you end up being everyone's beck and call, and like people think it's your fault that something has happened that's not your fault, and blah, blah, blah. And so narrative design is like quite a fraught position, because you have to kind of be at the intersection of every discipline. Whereas like people tend to leave you alone a bit more if you're just doing environment art, for example. So yeah.
And then I think this will be our final question tonight. What do you feel is the hardest part of good narrative design, and does that answer change depending on the medium? A nice general one for all three of you, I think.
Hardest part. Well, I mean, the hardest part, I think, for me is it's that age-old thing, right, of like communication and like how you communicate ideas, right? Like it's really hard to not only communicate to the player what you really mean and nail it and land it. And I guess in TTRPGs, it's like actually getting through to the GM, you know, efficiently what you need them to do and how the rules function. And also, obviously, the rule books have to speak to the players as well and have them understand what, like, easily. But it's not only that, communication with the player, but it's a communication with the team you're working on in video games, because the team tends to be massive a lot of the time. And actually being able to convey, for example, to the art director what you need them to produce can be very hard and challenging. And they have their own set of constraints they're working with. Like, for example, you can't have like a dramatic amount of polys on a model because it just is too expensive. So you end up thinking you're going to get one thing, and then you get another thing, and then you have to just work with that. So yeah, communicating ideas efficiently and like getting the meaning you need, it can be quite difficult. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree entirely. It's one of the things that that we're doing in ours. It's been quite good. Like many of the people in the stream were involved in our Ship of Fools playtest, and what they'll have seen is one of the things we do there is we're providing options with sort of an evolution of something that that Graham did in his director's cut of the Enemy Within with his Grognard boxes, where he kind of added in kind of alternatives to things for people who'd played through the campaign before or were familiar with what happened, so that they could provide options. And we've really kind of evolved and sort of refined that. And I've certainly found that quite liberating once I realised what we could do with that, because we can just talk very directly to the GM about ways that they could change things, ways they could implement things, different ways to kind of do it. And yeah, that I have found, compared to stuff we did on say Warhammer, I find that quite freeing, because actually I've been able to just like there's much less filter between what I want and what I want the GM to know. Like I'm able to just literally just say it to them instead of wrapping up inside.
Is the Warhammer writing where like you're in a room that's decorated with skulls, and there's skulls on top of the skulls, and then there's skulls on the curtains, and there's
don't forget the
curtains.
Spikes. There's the spikes. The skulls are on.
And some more skulls on top of your,
And let's not forget the maggot-ridden pus.
Yeah. yes, the maggot.
Brian Ansell, when I was working on Realm of Chaos way back when at Games Workshop, stuck his head round my office door and said, "We need more maggot-ridden pus, and then kept walking. And I was like, I'll get right on that,
Yes.
And that phrase has just stuck with me ever since.
Well, that's us pretty much at the end of the stream. So all that remains is for me to say thank you to Cara, thank you to Andy and Graham. Just a quick reminder that if you sign up to the Rookery Patreon before 9th October, you get access to the Early Bird, a unique emoji designed by Mark, which won't be offered again. And also, if you sign up before 9th of October, you'll get a free copy of The Well of Bones, which is a system-agnostic location that we created as when we were asked to sponsor Albacon, which is going on this weekend in support of a Scottish charity, Penumbra, that supports children and young people's and young adults' mental health. So thank you for joining me this evening, and we will see you hopefully on Wednesday for not Between the Rookery, which I keep up Between Two Rooks. No, it is Beside the Rookery, and so we'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. She said.